page, and it's Wileman's Albert shape, which was originally called Jubilee flute. That the name was changed by Wileman in early 1887, I think, to commemorate Queen Victoria's 50th. Oh, interesting thing about the Albert shape is it's. Wait, Donna's helping me out here. What?
You should have that sheet up, shouldn't he?
Yes, he doesn't have it though.
Oh, we well,
That's what we're discussing. Could I have a book to set these things on?
Sure.
And the Albert shape is kind of interesting. It was, I believe, the third registered shape, first being square, then the Alexandra shape, and almost immediately after the Albert shape came up. But they were all kind of started out being called fluted. And the interesting thing is Albert shape has actually two shapes. One is registered and one is not registered shape. But we'll get into, you'll see what I'm talking about there. In doing this database, and I put it all in PowerPoint, and I've relied heavily on the first four pattern books, which I was allowed to photograph years ago. So I went through them fairly meticulously, looking for either Jubilee flute or Albert. And kind of summarizing, the estimated range of pattern numbers for Albert, it ranged from 3532 through about 6197. Those are the factory assigned pattern numbers. The approximate years of manufacture, as best I can recollect, is 1886 through about 1892. It got very sketchy on when Albert kept being produced, but I'll show you what we've got here. What I'd ask, it's a fairly lengthy, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through this, is that please hold your questions until the end, because, and we can refer back to them and bring up the slides you want. But okay, now let's jump to the use restrictions, which is actually, sorry, right here. That's good, Lyle. Basically, study is accurate to the best of my knowledge. This study may not be copied, reproduced in any form outside of the Shelley Club members. And I attributed a lot of this to the pattern book's copyright protection. I used several examples and illustrations from the pattern books. Okay, allow next, please. This was actually an international effort, this database. I want to thank personally Chris, Carolyn, Peter Perazzo, Bruce Sandy, and number of Shelley Club members who have allowed me to photograph some of their Albert patterns. And I've used also the Wileman Collector's Guide and the pocketbook of Wileman and Shelley Cups from Australia. All right, next, please. Okay, these are the two shapes I was talking about. On the left is the T shape and the mustache shape, which is actually just a little bit bigger, and that is the registered shape, 60868. This can be seen easily and identified by the square type handle and the tapered fluted shape. On the right is the coffee, and I believe that we'll call the demi-toss, not registered shape. And it has a different handle, Worcester type handle, and the taper of the fluted is not very much. Next, please. These are what the plates look like. These are just the three sizes I have. On the left is the larger plate. There's a saucer size, a bread plate. Now I will give you one slide here for reference later, the actual dimensions. Next, please. Okay, these not very exciting, but I have about, I think, 11 or 12 examples, and I've measured them pretty precisely. The same mustache and the teacups are the registered shape, a little bit different in size. I don't know if they made a breakfast cup, which would be the same size as mustache. Now on the right, you've got coffee cups, smaller, and then the bread plates and the large plate. But that's just for reference later on if anybody wants to look and see and help identify what they've got. Next, please. Now, this is very confusing. Even I get confused on eBay when I see a cup like this. These are three cups that aren't Alberts, but pretty close. The Wileman May shape, handle's different. The flute is nice. Well, the center is the Worcester shape. The handle is fine for the coffee, but it's not a fluted body. Then the Foley flute shape, which has a different handle, is not the Worcester handle. The best way to identify these I've found is use the Australian pocketbook of Wileman and Welly shape, of Shelley cup shapes. Next, please. Okay, now we're getting into it. As you know, I'm in love with Wileman. Next, please. Okay, this is a shape. I found this on eBay. It is a P type. You see the shape registration number on the back stamp, nothing else. I've asked when I got it, I asked Bruce Sandy and also asked Carolyn, had you ever seen this before? Nobody had ever seen this. It's not in the pattern books, but it definitely is an Albert. Next, please. Okay, here's another one that I picked up in my mustache cup collection, not in the pattern book. Again, it is very clearly an Albert because you can see the RD number on the base, but no Wileman mark, nothing else. Next, please. Okay, this is a pattern that's quite common to a lot of people. It's Victoria's 50th centennial, which was 1887, a T shape. And on the back mark, it has the shape registration and it shows the pattern registration for Victoria's 50th. Next, please. Okay, now we're getting into the real Albert. This is in the pattern book, 5332 Japan Oriental Flowers. Pattern is not registered. It does show a factory pattern number of 3532, and again, the registration of the shape. Next, please. Pattern 3632, black border, T-shape. Again, it doesn't show the shape registration, but it shows the pattern registration and it shows the factory pattern number. Now, to best of my knowledge, there was nothing in between the one I showed you previously and this one. So Albert came in kind of sporadically, it appears. Next, please. Good. Now here's the same pattern on a coffee, which is not a registered shape. Very pretty, but you can see the coffee and you can see the very different handle and the different shape of the cup itself, but it is not a registered shape. The pattern, however, is registered and the factory pattern number is 3632. Next, please. And here's a couple more. I like doing this when I find things on eBay. I see more of the different objects. I've done this with the squares and I'm doing it on Albert. But again, the same pattern number, but again, not registered shapes. Next, please. Okay, now we're getting into the more common way that pattern books work. One point I want to make, everything is highlighted in yellow are pictures that I have not been able to find. Basically, it illustrates under the thistle pattern, there were, in this example, there were 4 color variations. The only one I found is in the blue, but the other highlighted ones, maybe somebody out there has them, and if you do, I sure hope you'll send me pictures of them. All right, next, please. Now, here is the one blue, pattern thistle. Very pretty design. The pattern is registered, and it shows a registered shape because it's a T-type, and the factory assigned number, as well as the Wileman logo. Next, please. Behind on this. Okay, clover pattern, registered pattern. There are 5 color variations of clover listed in the pattern books. The only two I have pictures of are the blue and the brown, which we'll see. Next, please. Here is the blue. This was a picture I found on the internet. I do not know the back mark, but I'm pretty certain this is correct. And next, please. And the brown, both teacups and in clover pattern. Next, please. Okay, now here's a wild one. I haven't seen any of this. It's called Wild Rose Sprays and Butterfly. Pattern is not registered. Nowhere in the pattern books can I find a pattern specifically relating to Albert. However, the pattern that comes off the pattern books on the left is in the pattern books, but it's for a much earlier pattern, but it's also called a Wild Rose and Butterfly. The picture on the right is Wild Rose and Butterfly on a square shape, which I have. I'm assuming the Albert pattern looks the same. And supposedly there were 3 of them, factory numbers made under this, but I've never seen one. That's why they're all in yellow. Next, please. Bramble, another fairly common early pattern. Here we have 2 I found and 2 I haven't found. Next, please. Here's the blue. Very pretty. Now, interesting thing here, it appears that Albert pretty much stopped at this time putting the registered shape number on these. This is clearly a teacup. It's an Albert without question. It has a factory assigned pattern number and it has the registered pattern number. You can see it on the right. Next, please. Here's the same bramble in pink. It again, it shows the pattern registration number, the factory assigned pattern number, but it does not show the registered shape number. That's unusual for a lot of early Wileman. All right, next, please. Shamrock. Wow, made a lot of these. I only have seen one. Very pretty pattern. Interesting thing, you'll look at the last number on the bottom. They're not sequential. Or the last 2, they're not sequential. They just kind of hit and miss in the pattern books. That's why it's kind of tough to find them. But a very pretty pattern. I'll show you next, please. Shamrock. This is also used on square shapes, but again, clearly an Albert teacup.
Doesn't
Next.
look like a shamrock.
I'm sorry?
It doesn't look like a shamrock.
Donna says it doesn't look like a shamrock. Okay, well, I'm sorry, but that's what they call it. Okay, pattern 3675, Black Japan. Registered pattern. I don't have the back stamp on this one, but the black in this picture is actually black. This is opposed to the next couple where it's a very dark cobalt blue, but this is the black. Next, please. 3690. Now this is a teacup, and this is clearly identified as the blue. And sometimes if the pictures are right, you can see the dark cobalt blue as opposed to black on the Amari type pattern. Very pretty. In this case, this back stamp had everything. It's got the shape registration number. It's got the pattern registration number. It's got the early logo, Wileman logo, and it's got the factory assigned pattern number. Very pretty set. I bought this one off eBay, and there's still one out there. The lady, nobody else seems to be interested in it, but it's on eBay. But a very pretty pattern. Next, please. Now, here are a couple of variations of the 3690. There, I found a picture of a milk jug and another plate, not a saucer. Again, clearly identified 3690. Next, please. Honeysuckle. Another very pretty pattern, not a registered number. There are 3 of them seen, and 2 of them I have not yet seen. Next, please. Okay, here's honeysuckle blue. I think it's a very pretty pattern. Clearly 3767. Again, it doesn't show the shape registration, but it shows the pattern registration. Next, please. Here's one honeysuckle brown. 3767. Again, very attractive, I think. Next, please. And here we have honeysuckle red, 3770. Now I'm finding it's in the early pattern, or excuse me, the early colors. It's sometimes difficult for me to tell the difference between red and brown. And since these were captured pictures and I didn't have a choice of seeing the back mark, I'm guessing on red and brown. So if somebody has better eyesight than I do or has one that where you know exactly the factory pattern number, I'd love to hear about it. Next, please. Cornflower, another very pretty pattern, not registered. Have 4 of them. Again, pretty much in sequence. 37, 78, 79, 80, and 81. That's kind of unusual for Albert because they just threw these things in whenever they wanted them. Next, please. There's cornflower, blue, very pretty. Again, there's no, it's not a registered pattern. The shape is not, shape registration is not shown. However, the factory pattern number is shown and the early Wileman back stamp is shown. Next, please. Here's a striking one, I think. It's 3780 cornflower brown. This is a coffee. Again, there's no, it's not registered, but it does show the factory pattern number and an early Wileman back. Next, please. Now here's a real strange one. 3873 Margaret coffee. This is not identified as an Albert shape in the pattern books. It's called another shape. And now that, in my thinking, is clearly an Albert coffee. But the pattern books don't identify it. I forget what they called it, but it was not Albert. This is where for some reason, the pattern books kind of get they kind of goofy sometimes what they do and what they don't do. And I'll show you a couple more examples where they've done strange stuff. Next, please. Okay, nice and Mari. Pattern number 3942, registered pattern. This is a coffee. It's correct coffee. Shows the Wileman back with this is still the early, but I think it's the early Wileman back stamp. It shows the registration for the pattern, and it shows the 3943 assigned pattern shape by the factory. Next, please. Here's a pretty one. 3995 floral edge. It's a coffee. It's a registered pattern. Again, you can see it clearly on the back stamp. I'm going fairly quickly because I've got a lot. I've found a fair amount here, and I'd like to show everybody everything I've found. Next, please. Now, here's a really strange one. Jasmine coffee, clearly identified in the pattern books, but no illustration whatsoever. And I've scrolled through, I think, the first 3 pattern books looking for a jasmine picture. I don't think it shows one. However, there's a pattern in a late post-war Shelley plate called Jasmine. I don't know if it's the same or similar to the earlier Wileman jasmine or not. Again, I do not have a picture of any of the 3. Next, please. Jungle sheet, jungle print, jungle sheet. Registered pattern number. Again, I have 3 of them. I'm missing 5 of them. Next, please. Okay, coffee again. Jungle sheet, red, 3998. Next, please. Here's $39.99 Jungle Sheet Electric Blue. It shows the pattern registration, but again, remember this is coffee, so the shape was not registered, but it is clearly a coffee. Next, please. Here's Jungle Sheet in blue, darker blue. I always thought electric blue would be darker, but it's not. Now, again, an aberration in the pattern books, clearly identified in the pattern book as a daisy shape, not an Albert shape. Well, that's not a daisy shape. That is an Albert coffee shape. Next, please. Daisy border. Now, we got more of these. Registered pattern. The last one is out of much later in the sequence. They did sometimes the sequence of these colors jump dramatically. Next, please. Okay, there we go. Daisy border 4169, clearly identified on the back stamp. Next, please. 4170, electric blue, clearly identified as 4170 on the back stamp. Next, please. 4287, much later in the pattern, the factory pattern numbers, and heliotrope, I think that's the way it's pronounced, which to me is a dark purple. Again, clearly identified on the back stamp with the factory pattern number. Next, please. Ivy. Okay. Ivy is pretty common, at least in a lot of the early Wileman shapes. And in this one, it appears in the pattern book as being part of a special order. I do not think the factory planned to produce this pattern on Albert. Again, I'll show you another variation on this, so please. Next, there we go. Now there's an ivy in heliotrope, but again, identified 4649 clearly, and according to the notes in the pattern book, pattern numbers 4646 to 4651 were American special order dated April 1892. So that tells me it was strictly a special order and not for common usage. Next, please. Now here's where the real confusion comes in my part. The special order of the previous cups for all coffees. Nowhere can I find in any of the four pattern books I've got details on, can I find a T-shaped Albert Ivy. There's one, and I'm not certain that's the correct number because they had a golden brown listed in the listing of Ivy, but it was not for, it was for, I believe, for a coffee, not a teacup shape. But there's one, and I do not know when it was produced or perhaps what the real number was. All right, next, please. Here's a pretty one, Dresden Flowers, pattern number registered. Pretty much in sequence of the factory numbering. They did a lot of colors, and again, the pattern book says this is a daisy shape, not an Albert shape. Well, I beg to differ. It is an Albert coffee shape. Next, please. There's your first one. These pictures came from Alaska when we were up there, and I happened to see a couple of very nice collections. 6191 Dresden Flowers, electric blue. That is, and the handle is correct. My picture was a little bit off, but it is the correct handle. Next, please. Here we Dresden Flowers, golden brown, 6195. Next, please. Dresden Flowers, 6196, blue. Next, please. 6197, pink. And next, please. This is the last of my last of Albert pattern pictures I have gotten. This again is a souvenir, and like my souvenir squares, I can't find any of them in pattern books. There might be a pattern, might have been a pattern book that was destroyed, but this is clearly an Albert T, and it's came out of nowhere. All right, next, please. Now, I apologize for going so fast through this, but I was just showing you pictures. This will be available through Lyle's website. And again, I'd like to stress, you folks out there, if you've got Alberts that you're not in here as a picture, I would certainly like to have a picture of it and the back stamp so I can slot it in. It may be a new pattern number for all I know, or it could be one of the missing color variations. So I really would love to have, I'd like to keep this because this database will be the property of the club, and the club can do with it, the clubs can do with it as it likes. But I thank you so very much for your attention, and if we have questions, I'll certainly try to answer them. Thank you, Lyle. Yay! You want to see my uncle again? All right, are we on
Okay. You're
mute
not.
or not? Okay, any questions? Lyle, can you help me
Raise
here? I'm
your
not here.
hands or wave and we'll get to you.
That's better. I'm sorry. Questions?
Don't see any.
I've dazzled everybody with my BS, huh?
I believe it's called bamboozling them, but
Yeah, dazzle them with your brilliance or something
yes,
like that.
and
Yeah.
bamboozle them with the.
But again, this is an attempt to develop a database. I don't know if any of you have seen my Square database. I happen to like old Wileman stuff, and that's what I'm attempting to do, just to establish everything I can find out about Albert in this case, and all the pictures of the patterns I can get and put it in one place for for research for collectors. But Robert,
Comment, Dick. I have also found that what they did when they first used, can you all hear me? When you first used a pattern, was they entered it for a particular shape. But if they came back and used it on another shape, they didn't always bother to add that to the entry in the pattern books. So I think that might explain why some of the patterns appeared on Albert, but they were earlier entered for some other shape.
you confused me. It came up as Robert. That's Bruce. Sorry. But yeah, Albert didn't last very long. The coffee seemed to have lasted longer, but the Albert shape itself was, Alexandra far surpassed it, and a bunch of other shapes came out. But thank you. Anybody else? Lee's pointing to somebody. Sheila, who are we pointing to, Lee?
Carolyn.
Oh, Carolyn. Hello.
You're muted, honey.
Okay, hi. That was wonderful, Dick. Thank you so much. I just wanted to show this one. You did have an example of the electric blue in the jungle print, but it's interesting because mine, the color seems to be so different from the example you had. This is almost like a turquoise or a very bright aqua blue, but it's number 3999. And so I looked that up, and that is electric blue. So I thought it was interesting.
Well, thank you. If you'd send me a picture of it,
I will.
Of it and its back mark, I'd love to add it to, and any way I can improve this database, because it's going to belong to the club, and at some point maybe somebody will be interested in what Albert is or was.
Another interesting thing is that it does have the RD number for the pattern. The saucer is 117220, which is what you had, but the cup, it's a little bit blurred, but it almost looks like 117231, which that doesn't make any sense at all. So I'll send you pictures of all of that, and you can figure it out.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
So Dick, Ruth Jenkins has her hand raised. Ruth, are you there?
Sorry. Yes, I'm here.
No,
Ruth.
Ruth.
Hi. Hi. Yes, Dick, I very much remember listening to having you show us your Square database at the first Shelley conference after breakdown, my lockdown, my first ever one. It was really fascinating. One of the things I noticed with what you were showing us was that the back stamp was varying according to the color of the piece. Did you notice how often they did the back stamp in the color of the design?
I've never paid a lot of attention to that, but I think you're right, Ruth. But
I
again,
thought that was interesting.
well, I think the cups and saucers were often mixed up, as far
Yeah,
as,
but
well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Bruce can certainly know more
thought that
about
was
it,
an
and
interesting
Carolyn than
attention
I.
to detail, was to do the back stamp in the right color as well.
Well, it's about all I can do to keep the registration numbers of the pattern and the shape straight. I'm not worried about the color on it, but I think you're right. Thank
That was
you.
very enjoyable. Thank you.
I can comment on the back stamps. They seem to have been engraved on the same plate as the pattern, and therefore when they came to print them, they mostly seem to be in the same color as the pattern. And I at one stage tried to see whether you could actually date year by year or closer by the shape of the actual back stamp, because they vary quite a bit. But I decided no, it just depended on who engraved the pattern and how they interpreted the back stamp when they came to engrave it on the plate, because there are a few variations. And the only other comment about registrations is that I think, as I recall, they were for 5 years when you registered a pattern or a shape, and they could be renewed, but if they weren't, they presumably lapsed after that time period. But Wileman and Shelley later on seemed to have been a bit casual with their use of registration numbers. They sometimes put them on when I would have thought they had long lapsed.
Yeah, well, on the missing registration of the shape of the T, they didn't last very long. So I don't think they span 5 years, but some of them have it, some of them don't have it, Bruce. But I am certainly not an expert. I'm just an amateur trying to, put pictures to names is all.
Well, I wouldn't guarantee the 5 years.
Well, I'm writing it down.
Some of the British experts could tell us more, perhaps
Yeah.
Jerry or someone.
Can I
But-
can I ask a
Certainly.
technical question? You've stimulated thinking by you've stimulated the thinking by showing us several different colors of the same pattern. When that's put on, is it put on knowing what the color is going to be, as by somehow, I guess, dyeing the template that's put on before it's fired? I mean, how do we get a very dense pattern in a uniform color that's different in two different cups? How is that done? Anybody
Who's
know?
best qualified to answer that? I'm not sure who's.
Well, as far as I know, they were copper plates that were engraved, and they then applied, put the color glaze onto those plates, wiped it off, and then they put tissue paper in, and they put them all in a pressed it onto the tissue paper. Then they applied the tissue paper to the cup or the saucer, cutting it up if necessary to fit the shape. And then they then use soap and water on the tissue paper to peel the tissue paper off, leaving the glaze, which had been mixed with a little bit of size so that it would stick to the china, leaving that behind.
And then they fired it.
And then they fired it.
And would you use the same copper?
I think you use the same
Template?
paint for all the different colorways because
Yeah.
in early stages they painted on the numbers by hand.
Is
Well,
Marge
interesting.
Walker?
You're appearing.
Go ahead, Chris, sorry.
It was Marge.
Was it?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
Hi.
Dick.
I'm just in awe right now because of all the fluting on the cups, how much waste there must have been to get those so precisely in the cups, on the cups, to get the color onto the cups. And, they must have had a lot of waste.
well, I think just putting the pattern on it. You're right. I never thought about all the fine flutes. They're fairly fine flutes
Right.
but very defined on the teacups. I have no idea. It must have been very labor intensive to make sure it went in and out all the way around the cup.
Wow.
Chris Davenport, did you have a comment in that regard?
Yeah, just following on from Bruce, the copper plates were used and the ink was then applied to the copper plate, depending on how heavy-handed. Sometimes the person that was applying the paint to the copper plate would give you varying colours. If they put it on quite heavily, you would get it sticking more in the grooves, because once it had been applied, they then scraped it off, and as Bruce said, they then applied the tissue paper, which was then put through the press and rolled onto the tissue paper. The tissue paper was then pulled off the copper, and it was then placed onto the cup. Now, the lady was saying about how they got it onto the cups. The copper, the tissue paper would be the size of the actual cup. So the design which they had done would fit that particular cup, because some of the coppers did not fit some of the cups, depending on the size of them. So you had to have the copper to fit that cup size. So you would have had more than one copper plate for the different cup sizes. You didn't, one copper plate was not for a one for all size. So a teacup would not fit a coffee cup, and a coffee cup would not fit a teacup. But what they did do, when they did apply the tissue to the cups, they would have a little sponge which they would then push into each groove. So it was allowed to have sufficient to go from the handle right round the cup to the other side of the handle, and then they then applied the sponge to ensure that it did go into every groove, just the same as they would have had to done to the later cup shape, the dainty shape. So it was a process that was done, and the people who were applying it were very good at it.
For sure. Beautiful. Wow. Thank you.
I'm just curious, does anybody out there collect, Albert?
Here, poke your head over so you can see it, Donna. There she is.
Does anybody collect Albert out there? Not seeing anybody.
I do. I've got 12 of them, I think. I ran out of squares.
Dick,
one thing, I was just going to
Dick,
make a comment regarding the color of the identification of the pattern number matching the color. I've got a pretty complete collection of squares. I've got a lot of the color variations. I will check my saucers to see if that holds. And if the blue has a blue coloring in the back on the back mark or not. I don't know, but I can certainly check that. But I think Ruth brought that up, but I'll check on that. I don't know, but like I say, I think I've got my biggest collection of squares. That's where I've really got more knowledge than I do on Albert. Albert was just kind of a successor to squares, is what it amounted to.
Chris was talking. Chris said,
Chris, did I interrupt you? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. What you will get, Dick, on that, and as Ruth brought up, what you did have on some of the coppers, they would have the Wileman backstamp on the same copper plate. So therefore, when you then rolled out your tissue paper, the top corner of that tissue paper might have been the backstamp. So they would then have cut the backstamp off the main part of it and placed it on the bottom of the ware.
Thank you. David? David?
David, you're
It's
muted.
muted.
Listening to the conversation that's just been going on, and I'm looking at this, which I'm sure you can recognize.
Yes, I do. That's one of the
Um,
ones I have.
Yeah, I mean, this, if I understand correctly, is something like over 130 years old. And I look at the work on it, and I just marvel that I still got a cup and saucer from that age, and it's absolutely perfect. You know, when I look at the pattern and the way it's gone into the flutes, and it's lasted all this time, it just puts me in awe of the skill of the people that did it. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, I happen to have the same thing in I guess a quattro, all 4 pieces of that pattern. That's how I got the good picture of the plates.
Oh, right.
Well, so much of the Wileman is beautiful and has remained beautiful and bright and unchipped.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Wileman, especially back when these started to be made or not, if it was as precious to them then as what I think of as the Shelley factory making the Shelley was precious.
Yeah.
Yes, Lynn.
I have a little cabaret plate. It's got places for 3 cups and saucers. And if you see, it's in the black pattern. But it has 2 registration numbers on the back, 60850 and 84175. And I don't know if this is Alexandra or Albert or one of the other things. 60850
Lynn, say again, please.
60850 or 84175. It's the black Japan pattern.
Lynn, is it in a porcelain?
Or
Yeah. Is it in a porcelain platter, or is it some other kind of material?
It's a cabaret tray for like a bachelor set.
Earthenware or China?
China.
China.
Yep.
Lynn,
Yep.
I have the registration thing print, that Jerry did. I have it right here. I'm wondering if your first number you said 60850, actually 606650 is the shape Alexandra. So I'm wondering, is it a 6 instead of an 8, that middle digit?
It could be. I'm having a real hard time reading it.
Right. And the other number you mentioned, 84175, that's
It's
the registration.
60850. It's not a 6 at all.
Yeah, okay. That's actually not listed on the registration list. And your other one is the shape there's the pattern for the Japan red and black. So the 84175, that's the registration for the pattern.
The 6 and the 8 look very much alike. It actually could be either.
Okay.
So, but anyway, I just wanted to know if you knew which one it was. I've got cups and saucers in Alexandra, that are the same pattern. Thanks.
I would approach it the same way that Carolyn did. The registrations I know of the Alexandra and the Albert were very, very close. And all date-wise, I would guess within a month or two of each other. But Alexandra was first, as I recall, and but Alexandra was much, much more popular over time.